Have you ever been around someone who let their every thought and emotion come spilling out of their mouth? Have you ever been with someone who, when hurt, strives to hurt others or whose words are impulsive and painful? What does it feel like to be around these individuals? Today, we're diving into destructive pattern number 3, unbridled expression, here on Master Your Marriage.
Welcome to another episode of Master Your Marriage. If you're new here, welcome. We appreciate you for being here. We do drop a new episode each week, so be sure to subscribe to the show. And if you find value from today's episode, would you kindly consider leaving us a 5-star review and a comment? It really does help us to get our message out to more places and be able to help more couples.
On today's episode, you might notice that we sound just a little bit different today. And we're actually recording from our mobile podcast setup because we're traveling at the time of this recording.
We're actually in St. Martin in the Caribbean for Robert's birthday, celebrating his birthday. So we're out of town and we have a little bit of a different setup today. So you'll just be getting just audio only, no video. But it is interesting how hard it is to keep the show going when we're traveling, and hard to find a quiet place.
Oh yeah, especially in a hotel. So if you happen to hear a lawnmower or a leaf blower start up in the middle of the show, just know that that's part of the ambiance that we're experiencing.
It is. So today we're going to continue talking about something that we started a few weeks ago. It's our series on destructive strategies that couples use in relationships when they get put in this thing called the crunch that we've talked about the last few weeks, which is essentially when they're not getting what they want out of their partner and out of their relationship.
Or it's not really going as expected, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I love this quote. Dr. Murray Bowen said, "We all have this an adult and an infant inside of us, but the infant doesn't have to run the show."
The infant doesn't have to run the show. Amen.
How many people do we know that let the infant run the show in their lives?
Well, I reflect on this quote quite often, even as I'm sort of assessing my own behavior. And I kind of have a little different way of explaining it, or my own take on it, that I want to share. And the way that I look at it is that inside each of us, there lies a natural man or natural woman, if you will. And it's that version of us that operates without bounds. The natural man is driven more by greed and vindictiveness and indulgence, and he wants to win any argument at any cost, even if it means stepping on other people. He's impulsive and reactive and driven more by emotions rather than principles. And so when he feels offended, he often retaliates, often returning hate for hate, pain for pain, hurt for hurt, and without consciously establishing sort of these parameters and principles to guide us, the natural man wants to take over. The natural man wants to rule our lives. And this is why it's so important to have and to cultivate a more principled and wise version of ourselves, which is why I love marriage so much. What I love about it is that it gives us that daily mirror reflecting back for us where we're still operating from the natural man. Marriage reveals these areas where we still need to grow, and that's such a great, beautiful thing because we can't change what we can't see, right?
Yeah, I love that about, again, and we talk a lot about letting your marriage grow you up and call it marriage university. You can get a really good degree there, maybe even a PhD if you work at it long enough.
Right.
Yeah. Well, if we want to have a happy and passionate and loving marriage, we have to be willing to confront this natural man, as Charlotte calls it, which really means dealing with the fact that our central nervous system is running the show. Let me explain. We all have these impulsive behaviors that emerge when we're upset, we're stressed, or we're not really getting our way. And these reactive behaviors usually feel good at the moment because, we sort of feel powerful and hey, I got that out, that frustration. And yet these reactions, that type of reaction, is really destructive for your relationship. These impulses come from the immature part of our brain, the limbic system, or the lizard brain, that drives these automatic reactions rather than the prefrontal cortex where pre-planning occurs, where wise and thoughtful problem solving actually happens. So when we're under stress, most of us allow our limbic system to take control, keeping us in this constant state of just automatic reactivity.
And this is key. This is really what we're talking about here in today's episode is this being in a constant state of reactivity and how damaging that is for our relationship. So when we feel hurt, our inclination, our natural man says hurt back. When our perspective gets challenged, our ideas aren't welcomed, we get defensive. When we feel pain, we retaliate with pain. And this causes us or can cause us to become quite cruel to the person we profess to love the most. And honestly, it starts to erode and destroy everything that is good and right in a relationship.
When do these problems typically start to surface in relationships? As we've mentioned in the last 2 episodes, all relationships go through similar phases. The first phase is what Dr. Terry Real calls love without knowledge phase.
So you love somebody, but you don't really have the knowledge of who they are.
You don't really know them. Right. And the second phase is knowledge without love phase.
So you know them and now you don't love them.
Right. Where you see all of your partner's limitations. And this is where couples sort of hit the wall. And then the third phase is the love with knowledge phase. And this is the final phase that is all about choice.
So you love someone even though you know them.
Love them, warts and all.
Right. And this is where we choose to bring our best in each other, right? I bring my best to you. I choose to work on my limitations for the good of the relationship. I choose to heal myself by focusing on me and my limitations, not on you.
That is so hard to do.
Right. And at the same time, I'm choosing, because it's all choice based, I'm choosing to accept or tolerate your imperfections because, well, you know what? A lot of the times I'm not such a catch either, right? And I choose to care for you and I choose to love you well, not because I have to, not because I have to stay in this for the kids, but because I choose to, because I get to.
That's the hard part, and probably the hard and the best part is
And the
this
best part.
choosing into your relationship. As we've talked about that on past episodes. We're all striving to get to this third stage, but we have to live less reactively to get there. We must reprogram our bodies and calm down in the face of frustration and constantly work to forge something wiser than our automatic reactions. This is where the core of the work in relationships truly lies. And that is why we're dedicating this series to exploring destructive patterns.
All right, so let's move on now and talk about destructive pattern number 3. So we've talked in the past 2 episodes, destructive pattern number 1 and 2. Those had to do with the need to control and the need to be right. Now we're talking about a destructive pattern number 3, which is unbridled expression. And unbridled expression is essentially unrestrained venting. It is irresponsibly and often harshly expressing whatever you think, whatever you feel, without compassion, without self-control. And you know what? A lot of what you see on social media right now actually supports this idea.
Yeah,
Where
I was going to say that sounds like social media to me.
Totally, where, I have a right to express whatever I feel. And you know what? There's no bounds to that. I should be able to express it, and you should have to validate it no matter what it is.
I'm just keeping it real, people.
And some people are under the truly under the illusion that this is somehow going to increase their intimacy, that it's going to bring them closer together somehow.
Yeah.
And it doesn't.
It doesn't. So we're going to share some examples, none of which I agree with, but it's a pretty good example.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So maybe you had this random thought that your wife's best friend had a much better body than your wife, and that in this world of brutal honesty, you should just get that off your chest because that's not going to bring you closer together.
Right. Or, okay, telling your husband that his body or his belly is disgusting to you and you can't stand to look at him anymore. How's that going to work in improving your connection? Right? Probably not.
I don't think it's going to work.
So those are a few examples of unbridled self-expression. We're gonna do some more in just a few minutes. But Terry Real, the therapist and the author that came up with these losing strategies, explains unbridled expression like this. He says, "Because I have a thought, I think I should get to express it. You know what? Because I have an emotion, I think I should get to express it. He actually calls it the barf bag approach to relationships.
Yeah, just dumping out all of those
Just
thoughts.
let it spill out.
Yeah. Well, and when people have no boundaries or any restraint in this way, they are enmeshed, they are codependent. And honestly, this is a way of controlling the relationship with words and with their emotions. And frankly, many people really never outgrow this type of behavior.
Yeah, I think that's key, right? Because what we're really trying to do is make someone else manage our emotions, or we're trying to control someone else with our emotions. And therefore, we're not separate. We don't belong to ourselves. So therefore, we are enmeshed with this other person. We can't manage our own thoughts and emotions ourselves. And so let's look at a few different ways that we've seen this manifest in, working with specific clients. So very commonly, unbridled self-expression manifests as the belief that, again, as we said, because I have a feeling, I can pressure you to now accommodate or validate that feeling and even manage that feeling for me, right?
Yeah, like,
We talked about this last
yeah,
week
we
a little
did.
bit.
Last week we talked about some of us grew up, and many of us maybe have grown up in households where one parent's emotions, sort of one parent or one member of the family may have just run everything. And everything revolved around that individual's feelings, whether it was rage, anger, or depression. The entire family was affected. You're just walking on eggshells in that household because somebody was feeling sad or somebody was feeling angry.
Right. And I have a client actually that I'm working with right now who shared with me that when he was a child, he would walk through the door and immediately after school start to scan the atmosphere to just gauge his father's mood. And if his father was having a really hard day, then everyone, of course, knew it. And they also had to have a hard day. And so he learned very early to map that, to map his father's emotions, and then have to, of course, lie low, stay off the radar, go straight to his room, and just sort of hide.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, it was like that for me. I mean, I grew up in a home that was dominated by my mother's depression, and we all had to accommodate for her negative feelings. And as you can imagine, it would dictate the entire emotional climate of the house. If she was happy, then we could all be happy, and if she wasn't, boy, we were just keeping our heads down and walking on eggshells.
So I want you to think for just a minute about your own childhood, because this is really common. So, who was that in your life? Was there someone in your household that was like that? I'm guessing there probably was. Who was that person? Was it a parent? Was it a grandparent? Was it a teacher? I know recently my son told me a story about his teacher and how she spills things out into the classroom and makes it a place where he doesn't like to be. Was it a teacher? Who was that in your life? Maybe it was you. So just think for a moment about your experiences with this and how it's caused you to feel and how you responded to it when you were around that.
Yeah, or how you felt like you had to respond. Unbridled self expression becomes a form of control. Whenever our behavior pressures other people to capitulate or accommodate the worst parts of us, we're really trying to control them. In last week's episode, we discussed criticism and insults, both of forms of unbridled expression. Since we covered those topics in detail, we won't really revisit them today. However, I do want to talk a bit about contempt and how it can be a part of unbridled expression.
Okay. All right. So contempt. I'm glad we're going to get into this today because contempt is the most destructive of all negative behaviors in relationships, often referred to as the worst of the four horsemen from Dr. John Gottman. In his 4 decades of research, he identified contempt as the number one predictor of all the things. It's the number one predictor of divorce. And when he observes one or both partners displaying contempt, he sees it as the clearest sign that a marriage is in serious trouble.
So, what is contempt? In simple terms, it's a form of unbridled expression where one person talks down to the other, treating them as inferior. Contempt can manifest as disrespect, sarcasm, and condescension. It also can show up in hostile humor, name calling, mimicking, even some body language like eye rolling or sneering. Regardless of the form it takes, contempt is corrosive because it conveys a sense of disgust and superiority. Contempt essentially says, I'm so much better than you, and you are beneath me. And when contempt is communicated, the effects can be, really hurtful and harmful.
So let me give you a couple of examples of contempt, and I just want you to listen for how it is speaking down to the other person as though they're so much beneath you, right? So, for example, look, I learned how to tell time when I was 5. When are you going to figure it out,
Oh, that's brutal.
right?
This one's tough. We haven't had sex in months. What, are you like too busy flirting with a guy at work? Why don't you just go be with him instead?
Right.
Oof.
Ouch.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of ways we do contempt, but the reason I wanted to include contempt as a form of unbridled expression is because it was my go to strategy when Robert and I were newly married, when we were in the crunch, as Terry Real calls it, when I wasn't getting my way. And honestly, I learned to do this really young. Like all children, we all learn by mapping the adults in our life. We learn what it's like to be in a relationship by mapping the adults that we watch. And we start learning this so early. And, we learn to map how to justify our actions. We learn how to control. And these things that I did, these patterns that I had were so ingrained and so unconscious that honestly, most of the time, I really didn't even see myself doing it, but I was cruel. And so when I would feel stressed or frustrated or unheard, when I wasn't getting what I wanted, I would resort to contempt. When I wanted to control, when I wanted to overpower Robert and get my way, I would use contempt. And for me, going back to what I said at the beginning, this was my natural man that I had to really work hard to overcome. And I wouldn't say I'm even 100% there because honestly, sometimes those cruel thoughts do still come into my mind. I don't know if that's the adult in my life that I saw do it. I don't know if it's their voice exactly, but sometimes when I get angry or flooded, I still hear it, not as often at all as it used to happen. It's pretty rare now, but the difference is that now I've just learned that a thought is just a thought. Just because I think something doesn't mean I have to say it.
Start over
Just
there, because I think that's really interesting. Just because I think something
yeah,
doesn't mean I have to say it.
right. Right? I can take a minute, I can take a beat, and I can actually question my thought. Like, is that thought even true? Was that thought even my thought? Or was that a thought that was actually an adult in my life, like when I was a child? Was that actually their voice that just popped into my head? Just because I had a thought doesn't mean I need to act on that thought. I can question it, and I don't need to spill everything out of my mouth that enters into my brain.
Yeah, and I wonder, it just specifically in our relationship, since we share these stories, why I don't want to say okay with it, but like I almost expected that. But I think that's because, again, we model and we map what we learn from our parents, and my mom was really good at this as well. And so I think she would display that in the midst of frustration and anger. And so I guess maybe, you put these two couples together who both have these patterns and they think it's okay for a while. And until for some reason we decided it wasn't.
Well, until it becomes too painful.
Yeah.
And I think the truth is that we all tend to marry our unfinished business, and for both of us, those early childhood experiences, that was our unfinished business. And we get into relationships where we have the opportunity to heal ourselves, but we heal ourselves by focusing on ourselves rather than focusing on the errors of our partner. And that's the key. Like, can I actually stop and see these patterns in myself and work on me versus just focusing on you and all the ways you're limited?
Yeah, I think that's probably the more informed version of that for sure. So, interesting fact about contempt. I know we've talked about this before, but research has shown that couples who frequently express contempt on both sides are more likely to suffer from infectious diseases like colds and flus. So, not only does contempt predict the future health of a relationship, it also predicts the future health of those people involved. Contempt is one of the most damaging of all forms of unbridled expression.
Yep. And the number one predictor of divorce.
And the number one predictor of divorce.
So, unbridled expression, again, it's a disregard for the feelings and perspectives of other people. Its goal is to overpower someone else so that we can get our own desires and our own opinions and our own emotions to dominate. And this type of communication becomes obviously toxic and really damaging to the relationship.
Yeah. One of the key aspects of unbridled expression is the absence of empathy. Individuals who do this behavior are usually so consumed by what they want and getting their needs to dominate that they don't really see the needs of others. We have a really good two-part series we did a couple of months ago on empathy here on the podcast that would be an excellent follow-up to this episode if you haven't heard it.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah.
So, what do we need to do to overcome unbridled expression? Well, kind of what we've been talking about all episode. Not every thought that enters your mind needs to be spoken. Not every emotion needs to be necessarily expressed. But it has to begin first and foremost with self-awareness. Like I said, I didn't really even, because it was just so ingrained in me, I didn't even see sometimes where I did it. And we can't change what we cannot see. So we have to pause and look at those areas where we're blaming someone else for how we're feeling, we're blaming someone else for how we're behaving, and we have to take responsibility. So to heal ourselves, like I said earlier, we have to focus on ourselves rather than our spouse. We have to look at our own reactivity, especially when we're not getting what we want, especially when we're stressed, especially when we're frustrated.
Okay, so based on what we've talked about in this series so far, we have additional journaling questions for you to ponder this week. All right, so let's reflect. And here are some questions, some prompts for you. List the times when you're frustrated in your relationship and you're not getting what you want. Now, next, notice what strategies did you use? Did you need to be right? Were you controlling? Were you using unbridled expression? And then next, how is this hurting your spouse?
Next, where did you learn these strategies? Was there someone in your life that used these strategies when you were growing up, like what I shared today? And how did that impact you as you think back? Next, let's start to analyze. What is it that you want to do instead? What might your best self be doing in these situations where you've used unbridled expression or either of the two previous losing strategies that we've talked about?
And then finally, plan to interrupt this old behavior, because that's really what this is about. We're learning new behaviors and we want to interrupt the old behaviors, right? So what are some upcoming opportunities for you to practice? What wisdom do you want to remember the next time you feel yourself losing some control?
Awesome. Yeah. What do you want to remember? What from this episode do you want to remember? And I think we'd love to even hear some of that from you. We're going to be over on social media talking about it this week. So come on over and share with us some of the learnings you've had from this episode. But I think that's going to be a wrap for today. Make sure that if you haven't yet, that you go ahead and subscribe to the show, because next week we're going to be moving on to the next destructive pattern that is really common in relationships. So thank you so much for being here today. We're grateful for all of you. We kindly ask, if you haven't yet, please leave a comment and a 5-star review. It really does help us to make a greater impact, to be able to help more couples. And probably more importantly, if you know someone who this episode might help, would you consider sharing it with them?
And of course, as always, be kind to each other this week. Take care of each other. And remember, it's the small things done often that make the biggest impact.
Until next time.